A black woman like you, nothing you wear will ever be real, Lieutenant Keller shouted before ripping the dress off the black woman in the middle of a crowded square. What struck everyone wasn't just the brutality, but her composure. She didn't resist, didn't scream, and then, slowly, the people around began to fall silent as they recognized who she was. The wife of Jaden Cole, the world champion fighter who had held the title belt for 10 consecutive years. Within 5 minutes, the entire police station was surrounded by the press. Where do you live? If you saw it with your own eyes, would you stay silent? The glass doors of Northway Mall hissed open with a sterile sigh, and Amara stepped through like silence slicing into static. Her white dress, plain, unbranded but sharp in its grace, caught the strip lights and turned their glare into something soft. She didn't walk like someone shopping. She moved like someone arriving where she was meant to be. Every step carried an invisible weight, every blink an unspoken reason, and it was that stillness in motion that drew attention. Not the dress, not her hair, not even her sharp cheekbones. It was the confidence of not asking permission. Officer Nolan saw it too, and he hated it immediately. He didn't stand. He leaned, one hand on the rail near the food court entrance, the other wrapped around his belt like it was a badge of war, not of service. His posture said, predator dressed as protocol. He didn't nod, didn't greet. He barked, "Ma'am, I need you to stop right there." Amara paused, not startled, not alarmed, just paused, like someone waiting to see if the interruption deserved her time. Nolan pushed off the rail, eyes sweeping her figure with a kind of entitled calculation. Then his gaze landed on the fabric tag clipped to her tote bag, a simple rectangle embroidered with the words "Veteran Family." It wasn't flashy. It wasn't a statement, but to Nolan, it was a challenge. He sneered, lips curling with a superiority too lazy to hide. "Veteran family?" he scoffed. "Cute." His fingers tapped the radio on his vest, but he didn't speak into it. The gesture was pure theater. "I need to see your ID," he said, stepping closer. "We've had some issues with undocumented movement in this area. You look like you might be new." Mara tilted her head. "New?" she echoed, tone flat, like she was tasting the word and finding it spoiled. "You don't look local," Nolan added with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile men wear when they're daring you to flinch. "Just routine," he lied, already moving in. Amara's voice was quiet but cut glass. "No, thank you." "Are you refusing?" he asked, stepping forward again. "I'm declining," she corrected. "There's a difference." "Ma'am," he said, but now the word was heavy with condescension. "You can't just walk through like you own the place. You fit a profile. Don't make this harder." "I'm a citizen of this country," she said, voice low, unshaken. "I'm not required to submit to arbitrary stops because I look new." Nolan grinned. It was ugly. "Big words," he murmured, eyes sliding down her neckline, lingering too long. "You know what happens when people refuse lawful orders, right?" She didn't respond. She didn't have to. That silence was gasoline, and Nolan lit the match. He stepped forward, closing the space between them in half a second. His hand reached out, not in warning, not in caution, but with ownership. Fingers pressed into her shoulder, not to guide, but to dominate, to invade. His touch wasn't accidental, it was deliberate, and it was laced with warning. Amara didn't flinch. She didn't recoil. Her back straightened, her chin lifted. "Don't touch me," she said, not loud, but the words cracked like a whip. "I am a citizen of the United States, and I am under no obligation to bow when insulted." Nolan leaned in until his breath reached her jaw. The mall's ambient hum dulled behind the tension tightening between them. "You're going to learn," he whispered, voice laced with menace, "exactly what happens when you act like you're above the law." Amara's eyes locked onto his, steady and unyielding. No rage, no fear, just certainty. Her silence dared him to go further, and that, more than any curse or scream, was what threatened him. Because power built on nothing cannot stand stillness. Behind them, people passed. Some slowed, most kept walking, a few glanced, fewer stopped. No one stepped in. That was the real crime. The guard at the corner kiosk looked away. A teenager at the soda machine turned up his music. A woman dragging two toddlers blinked, then picked up her pace. Complicity wore many faces, and in that moment, Nolan's smirk told the truth. He knew none of them would stop him. He leaned just slightly, pressing the boundary again, not physical now, but moral. His eyes narrowed, pleased with her stillness, mistaking it for submission. But what he didn't know was this. Amara wasn't still because she was afraid. She was still because she had measured the moment and chosen not to back down. And somewhere beneath that mall's sanitized lighting, behind polished tile and brand names, something sacred had been trespassed. Not her privacy, not her ID, her dignity, and she would not forget it. She didn't move, not even after his breath cooled the side of her face like a warning. Amara stood rooted, wrapped in steel beneath her skin. Her silence was not surrender, it was defiance. Poised, measured, waiting for Nolan's next mistake, and he delivered it with the eagerness of a man too used to power and too drunk on impunity. With the flick of a wrist, disguised as duty, Nolan reached for the hem of her dress. Not the wrist, not the ID badge, not the bag. He went for the cloth that wrapped her dignity. His fingers twisted and pulled like tearing paper. He thought it worthless. A sharp sound cut through the mall fabric, ripping under pressure. It was loud, obscene, not because of volume, but because of meaning. White cotton split, thread by thread, as a section of the dress tore away at the shoulder seam and slipped downward. It took less than a second, but what spilled into the moment was centuries. Amara's dress had been modest. Now it hung crooked and exposed. One side drooped low, the torn strap sliding down her arm, revealing her bra strap and the curve of her upper chest. Her skin was bare to the fluorescence above, her body involuntarily placed on display like a product in a glass case. But it wasn't the skin that burned. It was the humiliation, precise as a scalpel. Gasps echoed, footsteps slowed, phones tilted discreetly at first. The crowd had not been brave enough to stop Nolan, but they were bold enough to capture her shame, as though it belonged to them, as though her exposed body was a spectacle, not a crime scene. Nolan raised his hands slowly, palms open, an actor in a well-rehearsed play of false concern. "Ma'am, hey, it's a simple misunderstanding," he said, mock surprise bubbling under the surface like bile. "Just a routine check. These things happen. Fabric's delicate nowadays." His voice oozed with mockery, fake innocence wrapped in uniformed authority. The slight grin he tried to suppress betrayed him. He enjoyed this. Amara didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply lifted one arm to cover herself, shielding her chest, her face now flushed. But not from embarrassment. It was fury. Contained, seething, dignified fury. Her eyes didn't dart. They drilled into Nolan, unmoved, unafraid. She didn't beg for modesty. She reclaimed it, even in disarray. A few feet away, a group of middle school students walked by, their bright backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. Among them, a little girl with tight curls and a unicorn notebook stared too long. Her small face twisted in confusion, then trembled. She clutched the notebook tighter, eyes wide with something too complex for her age. Injustice. And then the tears came, silent, pure. Nolan didn't notice, or he did and didn't care. His voice cut through the gathering crowd like a chainsaw. "Anyone recording, this is an active investigation. I have the legal right to confiscate your device," he barked louder than necessary, a theater of threat designed to shake confidence. His badge flashed like a weapon, not a shield. But his eyes weren't scanning for danger. They were hunting for control. People hesitated. Some lowered their phones. Others, emboldened by distance, kept filming with trembling hands. But no one stepped between him and Amara. Not yet. She hadn't said a word. She didn't need to. Her posture, even half exposed, spoke louder than Nolan's barking. Her arm didn't tremble. Her breath was steady. Her gaze refused to drop. The silence became unbearable for him, because in that silence, Nolan heard the truth. He'd crossed a line no badge could protect, yet he smiled. He smiled because he believed the system was on his side, because men like him had been doing this for decades, grabbing, mocking, humiliating, and walking away with pensions and applause. He smiled because power, when left unchecked, rots into cruelty. But this time something felt different. There was no applause, only the whir of escalators, the distant chime of a toy store door, and the soft, steady whimper of a child who didn't understand why the world felt less safe just because a woman wore white. And then someone hit record. It happened without a speech, without a warning, just the instinctual flick of a thumb by a stranger standing 20 feet away, halfway hidden behind a pillar of cologne ads. A phone was lifted, a lens steadied, and the world began to see. What the phone caught was unfiltered and cruel in its clarity. The shot framed Nolan's face in profile. The exact moment his hand seized Amara's dress, the sharp rip of fabric, echoing faintly through the ambient noise. But it wasn't just the act that shocked. It was the look on his face, a satisfied, almost gleeful sneer stretched across his lips, the corner of his mouth twitching with something vile. There was no tension, no hesitation, only the swagger of a man who believed he was untouchable. The close-up was surgical. His narrowed eyes, the flash of teeth, the little breath he exhaled, like he'd just won something. He looked pleased, and then came her voice, clear, calm, devastating. "You're not the law, you're the stain on it." The line dropped into the audio like a gavel in a silent courtroom. No theatrics, no raised voice, just truth, raw and polished like a blade. The camera didn't shake, the angle didn't flinch. The moment landed like thunder, and when the stranger hit upload, it detonated. TikTok cracked first. The algorithm fed on outrage like oxygen to fire. Phones across the country buzzed within minutes. Twitter followed, pushing alerts that read like headlines. Police officer strips woman in broad daylight. Another notification pinged. Incident at Northway Mall sparks public outrage. Screens everywhere lit up with thumbnails of Amara Midsay, her torn dress captured like a wound in digital amber. The video raced through networks faster than emergency responders ever could. By the 10th minute, it had jumped continents. At 15 minutes, it hit its first million views. Comment sections lit up like riots. No filters, no euphemisms, just unedited fury. One user posted, "Her name? Her story? Don't let this vanish in the scroll." Another, "This isn't protocol. This is perversion in uniform." But it wasn't just faceless anger. The video had receipts. One clip, shot from a different angle, caught someone in the crowd saying Nolan's full name aloud. Not just officer, not just cop. They said it like a curse. And in the flood of response, people started digging. It didn't take long. Wasn't he the one from that West Side precinct? The one with the harassment case? Check the report from 2019. He pushed that veteran at the food shelter. Reddit threads linked screenshots, local blog archives, grainy screenshots of Nolan in different uniforms, different cities, but the same face, always the same face. Someone even dropped a quote from an old forum post. "You can transfer rot, but you can't hide the smell." And just below the original video, buried between reaction gifts and angry emojis, a single comment began to rise. Within 15 minutes, it passed 10,000 likes. She didn't scream. She didn't break. Who is she? Whoever she is, I hope she doesn't stay silent. The floodgates broke. Influencers reposted the clip, journalists flagged it, activists threaded it into larger calls for systemic reform. But this wasn't just another viral outrage cycle. Something about the footage, its stillness, its savagery, its intimacy, made it stick. This wasn't just an incident, it was an exposure. And Nolan, for the first time, his grin cracked. The clip hadn't been online for even an hour before it crossed Jaden's screen. No context, no prelude, just a flash of movement and pain, followed by silence so thick it cracked something inside him. The gym smelled of sweat and eucalyptus. His students were halfway through a drill, but none of that mattered now. On the screen, he watched the fabric tear again, frame by brutal frame. Watched the look in Amara's eyes, steel under fire, and the venomous grin of the man who had laid hands on her. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. When the video ended, his phone stayed in his hand like it had fused to bone. He didn't speak. He turned. A whistle sliced through the air, cutting short a punch mid-swing, His students froze as if struck by an invisible force. Jaden said nothing. He simply removed the gloves from his hands with the kind of precision reserved for rituals, not workouts. Each motion is deliberate. He placed them on the bench, side by side. Then came the watch. Sleek, black, military issue. He unstrapped it, set it down without a sound. His hands moved next to the locker, fingers reaching not for a towel or change of shirt, but for a chain tucked behind the door. From it, a single ring hung, a wedding band, worn silver and dull from time, but still shining in all the ways that mattered. He slid the ring onto the chain around his neck, not onto his finger, not yet. "Where are you going, Coach?" one of the boys asked, barely above a whisper. Jaden turned his head slightly, just enough for his voice to carry, but his eyes to remain distant. "Today," he said, "the world needs a different kind of training." He walked out without checking his phone again. He didn't post, didn't text, didn't explain. The door closed behind him with a finality that felt like a fuse being lit. Across town, the doors to Northway Mall slid open once more, but this time they didn't greet hesitation or shopping bags. They met footsteps, steady, deliberate, echoing. Louder than the mall's piped-in music, louder than the murmurs, louder even than the aftermath of scandal, still hanging in the air like static. Jaden walked in without flinching. His presence was not loud, but it bent the space around it. His movements were too precise to be casual, too focused to be mistaken for coincidence. Every step was a countdown. The mall, still buzzing from what had happened hours ago, seemed to still itself again as he passed. Even without a word, something shifted in the air, an undercurrent of reckoning. Cameras turned discreetly. Staff members pretended not to watch. But the sound of his boots on polished tile spoke louder than questions. The click of each heel was a metronome for justice long overdue. Jaden didn't bring a weapon. He brought memory. He brought silence, sharpened by years of restraint, loss, discipline, and love. The kind of love that doesn't write poems or buy roses. The kind of love that walks into a storm without an umbrella because someone you love is wet and shaking in the middle of it. And as he moved through that glass cathedral of consumption, every click of his boot on the ground was a message to the man who thought ripping a woman's dress was just a moment of power. Jaden didn't need sirens. He didn't need lights. He didn't need a badge. He was coming. And this time, justice wouldn't wear a uniform. He didn't walk in. He arrived like the closing note of a symphony that had held its breath too long. The glass doors of Northway Mall had barely slid open before the silence fractured with a sound that didn't belong to retail or routine. A fist meeting flesh. The hit wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical, but it was perfect. Jaden's knuckles kissed the bridge of Nolan's nose with clinical precision, the kind you don't learn from bar fights but from rings, from discipline, from a life where violence was calibrated, not sprayed. Bones struck cartilage, and in less than a heartbeat, Nolan's body reacted the way all bullies do when real power answers. It folded. He dropped backward, not in slow motion, but in humiliating reality. His back collided with the cold iron bench behind him, the sound of the impact sharp against the polished floor. Blood followed, thick, red, no longer hidden under uniform or arrogance. A single drop hit the pristine white tiles like an accusation. Amara didn't move. Her eyes tracked the chaos like a conductor watching the orchestra respond to her silence. She didn't rush, didn't flinch. Only her lips parted, just enough to whisper what felt like a command from another realm. "You came." Nolan screamed not from pain, but from disbelief. The kind that curdles in the throats of men who think their badge is a shield. "You? Do you even know what you just did?" Jaden didn't blink. His voice came low, steady, but every word cut like a blade, honed for this moment. "You know the law," he said, taking a step closer, his eyes burning into Nolan's confusion. "I am the law. When you forget what decency looks like." There was no more sound in the mall, just breath being held. Someone's phone clattered to the floor. The recording continued. The logo stitched on Jaden's sleeve glinted under the fluorescent lights. A coiled serpent wrapped around a golden fist, the unmistakable insignia of the Apex Combat Federation. A woman near the perfume counter gasped. Another dropped her shopping bag. They had seen the video of the man who taught federal agents how to disarm without killing. The fighter who'd once walked away from the championship ring undefeated, not because no one could beat him, but because he knew when to stop before the system used him for sport. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the man on the ground, his authority leaking down his collar in crimson streaks, his ego splattered where his arrogance used to stand. Nolan's voice cracked, a sputtering mess of pain and panic. "You can't just—" Jaden leaned in, crouching just enough so only Nolan could see the truth behind his eyes. "You tore a woman's dress in public and thought the law would hold your hand. I'm not the law you trained for. I'm the consequence you prayed would never show up." Another step back, another stare from Jaden. He didn't raise his hands again. He didn't have to. The message had landed. The punch was just punctuation. The silence that followed was the real sentence. Nolan clutched his face, blood seeping through his fingers like his dignity through the cracks of his uniform. His gaze darted around, seeking allies, cameras, any authority that could reverse what just happened. None came. Only lenses, only eyes. Hundreds of them. Witnesses not to a brawl, but to a shift. Jaden adjusted the collar of his jacket, not in vanity, but ritual. It was the only movement he allowed himself, as if signaling that what needed to be done had been done. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at Amara. She stood tall, her arms no longer clutching herself. The ruined white dress still hung from her frame, but in that moment it felt like armor, her dignity intact, her silence louder than screams. She hadn't asked for rescue. She hadn't begged for justice, but justice came anyway, on foot, with a fist. The world didn't clap, it didn't cheer, but the collective breath exhaled across that marble lobby was louder than any applause. Something sacred had been broken. Something sacred had been restored. At the far end of the video, the frame caught the stillness of Jaden's posture, the way his shadow merged with hers. Two figures, unshaken. No screaming, no threat, just presence. And in the corner of the screen, just above Nolan's slumped figure, the words of the mall's welcome sign flickered in fluorescent irony. Northway Mall, where community comes first. But now, for the first time, someone had shown what community defense looked like. Jaden hadn't come to make a statement. He'd come to correct one. And Nolan, he would remember this day not for the pain in his face, but for the taste of reality he was forced to swallow when his illusion of power met a man who no longer needed a ring to fight. Because some punches aren't thrown with fists. They're delivered with precision, timing, and truth. And when they land, the world shifts, exactly as it just did. The echo of truth hadn't faded. When silence swallowed the mall like a tide receding after an unexpected storm, Jaden stood still, his shadow stretching long beside Amara's, anchoring the chaos in something heavier than violence. Presence. No one clapped, no one screamed, not a single soul dared to move forward, nor did anyone run. The air thickened, not from tension, but from shame. The kind of shame that doesn't shout, doesn't explain itself. It just lingers, stinging the skin like invisible smoke. Somewhere above them, a soft chime from the automated system signaled the closing of the glass doors. The sound was indifferent, mechanical, the last breath of a system trying to seal itself off from consequence. A young employee at the far end of the lobby stood frozen, then reached out, hesitating, before pressing the button that activated the security lockdown. Glass slid into place with surgical finality, a thin pane separating the mall from the crowd, from responsibility, from involvement. Her eyes didn't meet anyone's. She turned away like a bystander in a history she didn't want to be written into. Jaden didn't flinch. He took off his jacket, the heavy canvas fabric lined with quiet strength, and draped it over Amara's shoulders. No words, no declarations. just a gesture, a restoration. As the weight of the coat settled across her collarbone, it felt less like fabric and more like dignity being sewn back into her frame. Amara's fingers brushed the edge of the lapel, but her eyes didn't lower. She stood tall, unshaken, not in defiance, but in reclaiming something Nolan thought he'd stripped away. Her silence was no longer passive, it was electric. Nolan, still on the floor, groaned, his hands pressed against the tiles, slick with blood that refused to be wiped clean. He staggered upright, hunched, eyes wide with disbelief. His face no longer carried the smirk of authority or the arrogance of a badge, just panic, the kind only cowards wear when the armor of institutional backing begins to crack. Blood trickled in a slow ribbon down his neck, soaking into the collar of his regulation shirt. His breathing was erratic, not from pain, but from recognition. Recognition that the man standing across from him, calm, unflinching, wasn't just a husband, he was judgmental and manifest. Jaden turned slightly. His gaze found the nearest phone, still held up by a shaky hand. Its screen was broadcasting everything. No angle spared. The feed was live, and somewhere on the other end, the world was watching. He stepped forward, just enough for his voice to carry not only across the floor, but through the lens. He won't be the only one paying for this. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Each syllable landed with the weight of a verdict, a promise not just of justice, but of reckoning. A ripple moved through the onlookers. Not panic, not movement, just shifting weight, like people adjusting themselves under the pressure of being seen. Some lowered their phones. Others stared at the floor. One woman turned her face away, not because she disagreed, but because she couldn't look at herself in the reflection of what they'd all allowed to happen. And then Amara spoke. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It was clear, measured, and it carried through the space with surgical accuracy. "This is your police?" 3 words. That was all. But it was more than enough. More than the blood, more than the blow, more than the silence before. Nolan's legs buckled slightly. Not from pain, but from the collapse of a narrative. The one where he'd been the enforcer. The one where he could touch, rip, insult, and grin his way through any situation without consequence. That story was over now, shredded on the floor, alongside his pride. Jaden stood motionless, eyes locked on the man unraveling before him. He didn't gloat, he didn't smirk, he simply existed, unapologetic, immovable. In the distance, you could hear faint murmurs, not voices, notifications, thousands of phones buzzing, pinging, reacting to the image of a woman in white, blood on the floor, a man broken. The world had already begun to process what was happening, but inside the glass walls of the mall, time moved more slowly, like justice dragging its feet to make sure everyone saw exactly what it looked like when it finally showed up. Security personnel didn't intervene. Management didn't announce evacuations. No alarms sounded, because in that moment, even the systems designed to control the narrative understood they had lost control. All they could do was watch. Jaden took a breath. It wasn't for composure. It was for closure. Then he turned slightly, not toward Nolan, but toward Amara, his body angled like a shield between her and whatever cowardice remained in the room. Her posture didn't change. She hadn't trembled once. But the coat draped over her wasn't just a garment now. It was a declaration. The woman who had been exposed, violated, and mocked was now the only one standing in complete control of herself. The camera zoomed slightly, capturing the final tableau. Blood on tile, shame in motion, justice in flesh. The next chapter hadn't even started, but everyone in that space, silent, breathless, ashamed, understood one thing. Nothing would go back to normal after this. And for the first time, that was a good thing. And so the world kept watching, not because of the punch, not because of the dress, not even because of the blood, but because deep down everyone had a suspicion that this wasn't the first time Nolan's hand had crossed a line. It was just the first time someone had stopped it. The silence after Jaden's words rippled outward forward, and into that silence, the questions began to pour. But they didn't come from journalists or networks. They came from people who remembered, from inboxes long ignored, from voices once silenced. The internet didn't wait for permission. It never does. The first crack came from a username that posted on a lesser-known Reddit thread titled Thin Blue Lies. It was a grainy photo of a complaint form, typed, signed, time-stamped. Rejected. At the bottom, a red stamp read, "Case closed, lack of merit." The caption said, "I filed this after Nolan shoved my mother down our front steps. They said it was a misunderstanding. We still have the hospital bills." Within minutes, another user joined the thread, attaching a clip pulled from a forgotten local news archive. In it, a woman, elderly, black, her arm in a cast, described being pushed unnecessarily during a welfare check. The officer's name was Nolan. The broadcast hadn't gone viral then, but it did now. The momentum wasn't an explosion, it was a corrosion. Bit by bit, the sheen of Nolan's badge eroded. Former colleagues, past witnesses, even those who once defended the system, began to look inward and crack outward. An anonymous message was sent to a freelance reporter's inbox. Short, chilling. "I worked with Nolan. I saw him grab a kid by the collar for calling him sir instead of officer. I wanted to report it. I didn't. I regret it every day." Another message from a retired officer of color was more damning. "I tried. I swear I tried. But they told me bringing it up would ruin morale. They said I was imagining things, that I had a chip on my shoulder. So I shut up. I watched. I watched him become the man you just saw on the floor, and I said nothing. These weren't rumors. They were confessions. And once the first one fell, the dam didn't just crack, it collapsed." Within 24 hours, a public watchdog group released an unofficial audit. Nolan had been named in 6 internal complaints in the past 7 years, all dismissed. Not one went to disciplinary review. Most cited insufficient evidence or failure to meet reporting protocol. In one file, the word resolved had been handwritten next to the typed word uninvestigated. Hashtag after hashtag rose like ash from the ruins, but one caught fire. Badge of shame. It didn't trend like a scandal, it burned like a reckoning. Every repost of Amara's footage now carried the emblem. Every archived document unearthed from Nolan's past bore the mark. Designers made graphics, Nolan's badge overlaid with a blood-red slash. It wasn't just about a man anymore. It was about a machine that printed out men like him and called it justice. The precinct, under sudden siege of attention, issued a single-sentence statement. "We are reviewing the officer's history for compliance with internal standards." But by then, no one believed in their standards anymore. People asked, not what Nolan did, but how he kept getting away with it. In a panel discussion on a late-night political show, a former commissioner sighed into the mic. "We don't have a bad apple problem," he said. "We have orchards fertilized by denial." Jaden didn't respond publicly. He didn't need to. He had spoken already, and his silence now spoke louder. But Amara, in a rare public statement, posted without hashtags or fanfare, simply wrote, "A badge should never outshine a conscience." Those 8 words were screenshotted, reposted, and printed. Teachers used them in classrooms. Advocates painted them on protest signs. A muralist in Chicago spray-painted them over a brick wall where a boy once died during a mistaken police raid. Meanwhile, Nolan stayed silent, not because he'd learned humility, but because there was nowhere left to bark his justifications, no friendly press to spin his side, no department shield to hide behind, and no more room in the narrative for redemption he hadn't earned. His past, once buried under layers of bureaucracy and silence, had clawed its way to the surface like rot from under a polished floor. Every clip, every file, every testimonial was no longer evidence of isolated incidents. They became threads of a single, damning story, not just about a man with a badge, but about a badge that knew and still chose to look away. The question changed. No longer why did he do it, but who taught him he could. And the answer was cruel in its simplicity. The system didn't just allow it, it applauded it. Till now, It didn't take long for the noise to outpace the silence. The storm that had been brewing beneath the surface for years finally found its lightning rod. And it wasn't the media that lit the match. It was fury. Unfiltered, unapologetic, and already ablaze before the headlines dared to catch up. By the time major networks acknowledged the footage, it was already an inferno. CNN led the evening political hour with a special segment titled "Another Badge, Another Scar." The anchor's voice was measured, but the montage behind her wasn't. It stitched together years of brutality: Rodney King, Sandra Bland, George Floyd, and then Amara. Her dress, her voice, her silence, her question. "This is your police?" This question is now etched into the national consciousness. The media tried to frame it, but they were late. The story had already chosen its frame. Justice denied in real time. When a major African-American actor posted the video on Instagram, his caption wasn't theatrical. It was personal. "She's the wife of every one of us who's ever had to pretend we weren't bleeding." It wasn't a viral quote, it was a trigger. The post hit 1 million views in under an hour. No hashtag, just the truth. Then came the remixers. They took the footage, Jaden's punch, Nolan's fall, Amara's gaze, and looped it, slowed it, layered it over trap beats and protest anthems. Some called it art, others exploitation. Arguments ignited across platforms. Was turning trauma into content empowering or demeaning? Was this visibility or vulgarity? But even as the remix debate frothed, the core message refused to be diluted. Every frame, every re-edit, every repost still carried the same truth. Power had been caught abusing itself, and now it couldn't run. The police department reacted the way all outdated systems do, by retreating. First came the closure of public comment sections, then full removal from social media platforms. No statements, no engagement, just disappearance. Like children caught stealing and pretending silence meant innocence. And the most chilling aspect was that there was no silent system. But the people didn't need their platforms. A veteran journalist from The Atlantic published an op-ed that cracked through the noise like a gavel. He didn't just rip a dress. He tore through the illusion that accountability was ever real. The article didn't cite an opinion. It listed facts. Complaints dismissed, reports buried, footage ignored. It ended with one brutal line: he didn't act alone. He acted with the permission of every silence that came before him. That sentence was shared by academics, teachers, barbers, pastors, and veterans. Screenshots replaced slogans. People didn't just talk anymore, they read and they remembered. Meanwhile, at precinct headquarters, the press was kept at bay. No briefings, no apologies, a wall of PR silence. But silence in moments like these isn't neutral, it's cowardice with a badge. In classrooms, students discussed the incident. In churches, preachers rewrote sermons around Amara's image. In family dinners, her name was spoken with reverence and rage. It wasn't about celebrity anymore. It wasn't about virality. It was about velocity, and the story was moving faster than the gatekeepers could catch up. Every reposted clip, every black and white photo of Jaden standing next to his wife, every edited graphic of Nolan's bloodied face under the caption "Protect and Serve Whom?" pushed the story deeper into collective nerve endings. This was no longer a conversation, it was a current. Sociologists called it cultural combustion, when a single event strikes tinder that's been gathering for generations. And it wasn't broadcast in boardrooms, it was passed hand to hand, screen to screen, and voice to voice. No press conference could undo it, no internal memo could contain it. The fury wasn't abstract. It had a face, a name, a question, and an audience that had finally stopped forgiving. Justice wasn't waiting for a headline. It was already marching through the firewall of denial, one shared link at a time. The flames of outrage had engulfed the streets, the screens and the statements, but fire, no matter how loud, always leaves behind smoke, subtle, suffocating, and creeping into places unseen. And it was in that smoke that a different kind of voice emerged, not from a protest, not from a press release, but from the edge of a long, bruised silence. Her name wasn't announced. No cameras waited outside her door. She didn't wear white or speak with fists. But when Nolan's ex-wife uploaded a single folder to a secure server and sent the link to 3 independent journalists, she didn't do it for applause. She did it because survival without truth is just another form of captivity. The folder was simple, no dramatics, no letters, just evidence. 17 medical reports over 6 years, each one labeled domestic fall or accidental stairs incident. The same hospital, the same ER nurses' signatures, the same bruises in the same places, the kind that no staircase ever leaves. Attached was one audio file. In it, Nolan's voice was unmistakable. Not the barking authority the world had seen on video, but something more insidious, low, controlled, confident. No one's going to believe you. I'm a cop. I write the damn reports. You think anyone's going to take your word over mine? The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They slithered across the recording like poison. By the time the clip made it to social media, people had stopped asking if Nolan was dangerous. They started asking how long the system had helped him be. She didn't do interviews, but one journalist managed a phone call. No quotes, no identifiers, only this: "I'm not telling this for revenge. I'm telling it because I don't want to explain to my daughter one day why I let her think silence was safety." That line hit harder than any headline. It wasn't news. It was a revelation, and it cracked open a new chamber of collective guilt. The bruises Nolan left behind were no longer just Amara's. They belonged to a woman no one had seen, no one had defended, and who had once walked out of a courtroom with an envelope of photographs the police called inconclusive. Jaden, who had been silent for days, finally posted again. It wasn't a video, just a quote over a black background. "No one should be strangled twice, once by a hand and once by the silence that follows." The post received over 3 million shares in under 10 hours. Amara responded not with public statements, but in a private message to the woman, later shared with her permission. "You didn't just speak for yourself. You spoke for every one of us who learned how to clench our jaw and smile. Thank you, sister." The ripple was different now. It wasn't rage, it was mourning, not for the man being exposed, but for the years his shadow had stretched without challenge. Former colleagues began whispering again, not in posts but in private messages to outlets. "We knew he had problems at home, but you didn't report on each other. That was the code." Another wrote, "He once bragged about getting out of a domestic claim, said his badge was his reset button. I didn't laugh. I should have reported him. The wound had changed shape. It was no longer about one moment, one maul, one punch. It was about a history of closed doors, redacted files, and warnings dismissed under the guise of keeping the department clean. But this woman, who had once been told to keep quiet for the sake of the department's image, was now the image that couldn't be erased. Her records, her voice, her bruises, they now occupied the conscience of a nation trying to rewrite its definition of accountability. The most powerful revelations aren't shouted, they're offered. And she offered hers not in anger, but in calm precision, like someone laying down weapons built from truth, saying, "I kept these not to hurt him, but to heal myself." She wasn't a victim now, she was a witness to her history, to the system's complicity, and to the fact that no amount of erasure could ever fully cover bloodstains that were never truly washed. And as the news cycle spun, as hashtags swelled and comment sections overflowed, her voice remained steady in its absence from it all. She didn't need the stage. She had finally reclaimed the right to stand in her own story, and that, for once, was enough. From bruises to briefings, from outrage to order, when the flames of chaos began to settle, what remained wasn't just pain, it was a purpose, the kind sharpened not by emotion, but by preparation. And Jaden, always the man who understood precision more than performance, chose his next move with the calm of someone who had already won. No threats, no press conferences, No vengeance masked as virtue, just one appointment, made quietly, with a federal legal team whose reputation echoed louder than any outburst ever could. 17 pages. That's what the lawsuit totaled. Each page is a weapon. Each paragraph is a blade honed not for retribution, but for correction. The charges were clear, cold, and complete. Violation of civil rights, aggravated bodily harm, systemic abuse of power, and organizational complicity over multiple years. The language of the lawsuit was not inflammatory. It didn't need to be. It spoke in statutes, codes, and precedents that struck deeper than fists ever could. The evidence wasn't speculative, it was surgical. Exhibit A, a time-stamped image of Amara's torn dress, blood speckled across the fabric. Exhibit B, a high-resolution frame from the viral video, capturing Nolan's hand in mid-motion, intent frozen in pixels. Exhibit C through G, witness statements including minors and the elderly, all transcribed, notarized, and aligned with digital metadata. Exhibit H, audio clips from Nolan's ex-wife, matched with ER reports and sealed affidavits. Each file is placed with intent. Each piece tells not a story, but builds a structure. And that structure had only one purpose: to collapse the one that protected Nolan. The lawsuit didn't just demand compensation, it demanded transformation. $15 million in damages, permanent termination of Nolan's law enforcement certification, and a 10-year independent investigation into internal misconduct patterns within his department. The press caught wind, of course, but unlike before, they weren't breaking the news. They were catching up. When the legal team held their first briefing, they didn't arrive in outrage. They arrived in suits. Their voices didn't rise. They resonated. The lead attorney, a black woman with eyes like verdicts and diction like gavel strikes, stepped to the podium and read the opening line of the complaint. This case is not just about one man abusing his power. It's about an institution choosing silence over scrutiny. Then she paused. Let the room breathe. Let the truth settle. We're not here to burn the house down. We're here to evict the rot. Reporters scribbled. Cameras zoomed. Questions hung in the air. But answers had already been filed in triplicate. Jaden didn't speak. He sat behind his counsel, hands folded, eyes steady. The camera caught him once, briefly. No emotion, just presence. Amara sat beside him, not tucked behind, not hidden, equal in frame, in posture, in poise. She wasn't adorned in white this time. She wore black, not for mourning, but for clarity. When asked if she had a statement, she stood. The room went silent. She said only this: "I don't need to be comforted. I need to be heard." And she sat. Nothing more, nothing less. But in that moment, the line became a thunderclap, printed, shared, painted on signs, stitched into jackets, repeated in courtrooms. It became the heartbeat of a movement no longer screaming, but speaking with legal precision. Nolan, for his part, tried to counter through a union lawyer, tried to frame it as an overreaction, a politically charged ambush. But the court of public opinion no longer needed permission to dismiss his performance. His deflections met brick walls of documented fact. The case number was assigned within 48 hours. The docket, once buried beneath backlog and bureaucracy, was pushed forward with urgency. Because now, this wasn't just justice seeking blood, it was dignity seeking architecture. Jaden's silence became a strategy. Amara's words became doctrine. The lawsuit itself became a blueprint, not just for accountability, but for recalibration. And those watching, the victims, the unheard, the ones with folders full of denied complaints, began to print their copies of the filing, not for revenge, but for reference, because the system had finally been challenged in its language, not with fists, but with formality sharp enough to bleed. And so the retaliation began, not in fury, but in full sentences and footnotes, not with fire, but with facts. And facts, when chosen with intent, don't burn, they dismantle. It was a press conference, but it felt like a sentencing, not for Nolan, not yet. But for the institution that had wrapped itself so tightly in uniformed mythology that it forgot what truth looked like under fluorescent lights. The room was cold, by design, but the man standing at the podium was sweating, a slow, steady glisten above his brow pooling at his collar, not the sweat of exertion, but of exposure. The police chief, gray suit, silver hair, voice weathered from decades of statements that never meant anything, looked smaller now, not in stature, but in stance, because behind him, larger than life, projected on the full thin LED screen, was a frozen image the world already knew too well. Nolan, his face twisted, hand outstretched, fingers tangled in white fabric. Amara, stiff, stunned, spine straight, the moment the institution could no longer deny. The chief cleared his throat, the sound loud against the silence. Dozens of cameras stared, lenses unblinking, microphones perched like vultures. "We acknowledge," he began, voice a notch too high, cracking slightly, "that there was an egregious violation of both protocol and basic human dignity committed by an officer under our command." He paused, not for emphasis, to swallow. The room didn't respond. There was no applause, no protest, just breathing, and the whir of cooling systems trying to keep the heat of truth from overwhelming the air. His hands gripped the podium, then one let go, lowered, then the other. He stepped back and bowed, not a performative dip, full lowering of his head, eyes to the ground, the curve of his spine visible through the fabric of his jacket. When he straightened again, his hands shook, slightly, enough for the cameras to catch it. "Internal review has commenced, external oversight has been requested, and Officer Nolan has been removed from all active rosters pending permanent disciplinary action." Yet, in civilians and their families shortly after, a voice from the middle row, firm and without tremor, pierced the air. Why did it take a punch for any of this to happen? The chief looked up, directly to the journalist, then past him, toward the back wall where the group had entered silently. No chants, no slogans, just presence. A dozen individuals, all wearing black. Across each chest, printed in stark white, a photo of Amara. Eyes forward, no caption. They didn't cheer, they didn't speak, they stood, silent witnesses to a shame long overdue. The chief's voice returned, lower now, broken in a different register. "Because we were wrong?" No flashbulbs fired, no dramatic soundtrack swelled, but something shifted in the air, a crack in the granite. He continued, "We failed to understand that honor does not come with a badge. The uniform doesn't sanctify the man. That loyalty to a department can never outweigh loyalty to justice." More sweat, another pause. "We failed because we believed that silence would shield us. We failed because we thought dignity came with a press kit and not with truth. We failed because we forgot what we're supposed to protect." Another voice, this time quieter, from the left corner. "Will you resign?" The chief looked down, then forward. "I will not step down today, because it would be too easy. Instead, I will stay long enough to ensure this system doesn't get the chance to protect another Nolan. Then I will go, not as a gesture, but as a consequence." The feed is broadcast live across the nation. But the moment that trended wasn't any quote. It was a still frame. His face lowered. The screen behind him froze on the crime. The two images overlapped. The bow of remorse beneath the still of violence. When the conference ended, no one clapped. The crowd didn't disperse in chaos. They walked out like mourners leaving a quiet funeral. A funeral for delusion, for unchecked authority, for excuses. And as the chief left the podium, his final words echoed louder than any declaration of reform. "We failed because we thought honor lived in the uniform, but we forgot to check if it still lived in the man." The podium was gone. The chief had bowed, but the storm didn't end. It evolved. What followed wasn't a tidal wave, it was a dissection, methodical, surgical, and relentless. The kind of reckoning that didn't scream, it documented. And at its center stood Nolan, not in uniform, not with allies, Just a man caught in the floodlight of the very system he thought would always face the other way. The department released an internal memo early that morning. One sentence: Officer Nolan has been suspended indefinitely pending ethical review. But the wording was too late, too careful. The people had already decided the terms. He was no longer Officer Nolan. He was Nolan, the man under investigation. Nolan, the face of a rot long ignored. The Ethics Council convened a special hearing, streamed live, a sterile room, bare walls, no flags, just a table, a chair, and rows of silent observers behind one-way glass. Nolan sat alone. No badge, no insignia, just a gray suit that fit poorly, and a silence that weighed more than body armor. When the chairwoman read the charges, she didn't flinch. Gross misconduct, abuse of authority, ethical violations are unbecoming of law enforcement. Each phrase landed like a gavel. Nolan didn't speak, not out of remorse, out of disbelief. He'd always believed the system was a fortress, that his badge was a blade, that the silence of his peers was loyalty, not fear. But now the walls had windows, the armor had cracks, the silence had turned its back. Reporters flooded the hallway. Microphones were shoved in the faces of former colleagues. Most declined to comment. A few didn't. I trained him, one said, eyes dark. I thought discipline meant control, but what we gave him was entitlement. And entitlement, though he might be, Trump was more like. Another simply muttered, he knew the rules, he just assumed they weren't for him. When Nolan was asked to speak for the record, he broke down, not with an apology, but with a scream. I was doing my job. I followed orders. I protected the streets. No one in the room moved. No one defended. The stillness was colder than any prison cell. The department's legal counsel, present for protocol, stood up and left halfway through. Hours later, a formal letter was released. We withdraw all legal representation of Nolan. His actions fall outside the boundaries of our ethical defense. That letter was printed in full on the front page of the city's largest newspaper. The headline didn't use adjectives, just facts. Nolan stripped of badge, abandoned by department. A video clip aired that same evening. Nolan, leaving the hearing, walked alone toward the back entrance of the building. No driver, no escort, just a man surrounded by silence, his shoes tapping like hammers on tile. As he opened the car door, the camera zoomed in. His ID badge, snapped in half, fell from his hand and hit the pavement. He reached out to pick it up, then paused, looked at it, and left it. That moment went viral, not because of who he was, but because of what he had become. A man no longer feared, no longer followed, no longer protected by the uniform he once wore like a second skin. A former district attorney tweeted, "This is what happens when a system confuses power with virtue. Eventually, power runs out." But perhaps the most devastating blow wasn't legal or visual. It came from the internal archives. An email surfaced, leaked by a whistleblower inside the administration. It showed a direct order from 2 years prior, advising the suppression of prior complaints against Nolan to maintain public image during election season. Public trust cracked like dry paint. 3 officials announced their retirement within the week. The department's PR firm terminated its contract, citing irreconcilable ethical conflicts. But no press statement, no resignation, no apology could match the stillness of that broken badge on the pavement. Because for the first time, Nolan had nothing left to hide behind. Not law, not rank, not silence. The tools he once used as shields had turned transparent, and the city, for once, didn't cheer. I just watched. Not out of celebration, but out of curiosity. That justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't knock down the door. It leaves you standing in the doorway, stripped, named, no longer believed. The badge had fallen. The silence had been shattered. The image of a shattered man walking away without title or shield had seared itself into the public mind. But Jaden understood that victory isn't declared when a man falls. It's secured when a system is forced to rise differently. So they didn't celebrate, they legislated. Jaden and his legal team moved not with vengeance, but with vision. What began with torn fabric and public humiliation now took shape in documents thicker than police handbooks. handbooks. The movement didn't roar, it wrote. The petition landed on the desk of the State Senate Ethics Committee at exactly 9:02 a.m. It bore a simple title, Proposal to Establish Public Honor Intervention Rights. Attached was a single piece of media, a 3-minute video of Amara standing in that mall. No narration, no music, just footage. Her ruined dress, her silent defiance, her eyes stared at a crowd that watched too long before someone moved. It was called Amara's Stand. The bill sought to enshrine a right that should have never needed to be written, the right of any citizen to intervene without legal penalty when witnessing a public act of humiliation or degradation carried out by authority figures. No one expected it to move. Not this fast, not this far, but the climate had changed. This time, the narrative had a body count, not of lives lost, but of illusions buried. A state representative, older, white, Republican, stood in a chamber many thought would kill the bill. He held the petition in one hand and pointed to the still image projected behind him. My daughter wears a white dress every Sunday, and if someone ever laid a hand on her the way this officer did, I'd want a Jaden Carter nearby. Not a lawyer, not a bystander, a man who knows where the line is and what to do when someone crosses it. The chamber didn't cheer. It nodded. Jaden, seated silently behind counsel, said nothing. He didn't wear a tie. He didn't carry notes. When the chairman offered him the podium, he shook his head gently. Then he stood, walked to the center of the room, and placed one thing on the clear lectern. The wedding ring, gold, simple, worn. The light from the room refracted off its edge. No words, no need. That image circulated faster than any press release. A man who fought not for ideology, not for politics, but for the right to stand beside someone when everyone else froze. One speaker, a retired officer with 33 years of service, testified toward the end. His voice was steady, low. "If I'd been in that mall," he said, "I pray I'd have had the courage to do what Jayton did. And I pray we don't build a society where doing the right thing gets a man punished instead of protected." Amara didn't attend the hearing. Her presence was in the footage, the legislation, and the ring. She had already spoken with her silence, and the nation had heard her. The vote passed out of committee unanimously. Editorials followed. Not op-eds, manifestos. A columnist for the Washington Post wrote, "You can't strangle justice in the dark and expect it not to come back in daylight." Another in The Guardian concluded, "America doesn't need more slogans. It needs laws that recognize when a soul steps between violence and dignity." Jaden left the hearing without comment. He didn't need the cameras. The work had never been about them. Outside, someone called his name. He turned. A young boy, maybe 12, held up a drawing. Jaden, with a shield made of light, standing in front of Amara. "I made this for school," the boy said. "We're learning what courage looks like." Jaden took it, smiled, nodded, and walked on. Because sometimes justice doesn't wear robes. Sometimes it wears silence, clarity, and a ring placed in front of power so they'll never forget who it's meant to protect. The applause from the Equality Gala still echoed faintly in memory when she walked into the exhibit hall. No fanfare, no music, only the echo of her heels on polished stone, deliberate and serene. The light followed her not because it was staged, but because even silence knows where gravity lies. Amara did not smile, she didn't wave, she didn't speak, and still she consumed the room. Her presence was an assertion, not a performance, and the crowd instinctively parted to make way for something far larger than ceremony. There, in the very center, encased in a seamless box of glass, stood the torn white dress. It hung, not like evidence, but like a banner, soft and brutal in equal measure. Its jagged rip along the shoulder curved downward like a wound frozen mid-bleed, yet somehow it did not look weak. It looked victorious, defiant, and resolute. Beneath the display, a placard barely the size of a hand read in silver lettering, "A proof of pride, not a victim." That sentence did not scream. It didn't need to. It landed like a strike to the chest, blunt and irreversible. Around the display, guests moved slowly, reverently, like orbiting a quiet epicenter of truth. There were no flashing lights, No speeches, no sponsor logos, only breath held in awe and eyes that refused to blink. A group of fifth-grade students entered with their teacher, their chatter dissolving as they came closer. One boy reached for his friend's hand. A girl stared at the fabric with her lips slightly open. The teacher, voice steady but low, leaned forward and said, "This is why we talk about boundaries. This is why they matter." Her words didn't float. They etched themselves onto the moment like a chisel to stone. Nearby, a retired general stood motionless, arms behind his back. His military ribbons caught the light, but it was the broken dress that held his focus. "This dress," he muttered to no one in particular, "says more than 100 speeches ever could." His voice wasn't shaky, but it bore the weight of decades that had never prepared him for this kind of confrontation. Photographers didn't dare use flash. Influencers kept their phones down. No one wanted to reduce this display to content, because this wasn't content. It was a confrontation in its purest form. It didn't ask for attention, it demanded it, then punished those who looked away. Every thread whispered resistance. Every tear in the fabric was a sentence, a scream compressed into silence. Jayton stood just behind Amara, his hands at his sides, his chin slightly raised, his stance unflinching. He said nothing, yet everything about him declared, "I am still her wall." His presence wasn't about protection. It was about solidarity, not a shield, but an oath. Throughout the entire exhibition, he did not take a single step away from her. He didn't need to hold her. Her spine was already but his nearness underscored a promise that didn't need repeating. "I'm here, always." Across the room, a woman in her 60s dabbed her eyes, then pulled her granddaughter gently forward. The child looked at the dress, then at Amara, then back at the dress. She didn't speak either, but the recognition was there, the birth of a moral compass triggered not by lectures but by image, an image impossible to forget. What made this moment relentless wasn't volume, it was gravity. No actor could recreate the weight carried in that garment. No script could match the clarity of what it represented, because that wasn't cotton or polyester inside the case. It was what remained after dignity had been violated and reclaimed. Reporters didn't bother her. They knew better. The most powerful words Amara ever spoke were the ones she withheld. Her silence was so loud it pressed into her skin. She didn't owe interviews. She wasn't there to inspire or explain. She was there to occupy space, and that was enough. Her silence mocked every headline that once called her a victim. Her poise flattened every man who thought redemption was theirs to distribute. And the dress, oh, the dress. It hovered there like justice, paused mid-breath. It had been washed, but not mended. The tear remained exactly as it was that day, preserved, honored, not as a mark of shame, but as an emblem of survival, sharpened into a statement. It stood for everyone who had ever been ripped open in public and told to smile anyway. The final visitor that day was a young artist who stayed behind, sketching. When the guards began dimming the lights, he turned to leave, but not before writing in the guest book, in thick graphite strokes. She didn't reclaim her story, she rewrote the whole damn language. No curtain fell, no applause returned. Only the image remained, her figure lit in quiet contrast beside the shredded dress suspended midair, as if to remind the world you don't need to speak when the truth already echoes. It started not with a scandal, but with a silence that refused to stay obedient. After the exhibit, the cracks in the institution didn't come from protest signs or public outrage. They came from within the walls themselves, from those who had stood too close to the rot for too long and finally refused to hold their breath any longer. The first resignation came quietly, almost respectfully. A veteran officer with 23 years of service walked into a disciplinary hearing, placed his badge and service weapon on the table, and said with a voice that didn't tremble, "I refuse to let this badge die with my dignity." The room froze. No one applauded, no one argued, because everyone present knew this was not an act of rebellion, it was an autopsy. In the days that followed, resignations stacked like confession slips. Lieutenants, internal auditors, desk sergeants who had once laughed off complaints now typed out their own. Their emails sounded less like exit plans and more like release notes. From shame, from complicity, from silence. 3 oversight bodies were put under investigation. Their entire structures began to look like echoes of indifference, of convenient forgetfulness, of unchecked loyalty to the wrong gods. At the heart of it was one memo, dug up by a whistleblower who could no longer sleep at night. The subject line was coldly bureaucratic. Nolan case, containment strategy. In it, a senior official had written, "Keep the Nolan file restricted until the current political cycle ends. Optics must be protected." That line detonated through the internal network like a warhead. Screenshots went public within minutes. The apology issued afterward was textbook, flavorless and dead on arrival. Miscommunication, lapse in judgment. The same corporate rot is trying to perfume the stench of moral collapse. But no one was buying it anymore. Even those who once stood on the fence began to climb down. Some with rage, others with sorrow, all with eyes finally open. A precinct captain once known for his blunt sarcasm and zero-tolerance leadership admitted during a closed-door inquiry, "I thought it was just a joke, a ripped dress. How the hell did I not see what it meant?" He didn't cry, he didn't ask for forgiveness, but his voice sounded like something that had rusted long ago and was only now breaking free. Letters began pouring into Amara's legal team, not from trolls or supporters, but from officers, young, old, disillusioned, furious. One read, "Thank you for not staying silent. Because of you, I now understand that silence is a crime too." Another said, "We failed you, and we know it." Inside headquarters, a map was unrolled, pinned to a board, then marked over weeks with red threads, names, arrows, and dates. A visual web of collusion, a crime scene without blood but soaked in omission. The diagram was printed, framed, and mounted at the Department of Justice as a cautionary monument to systemic failure. No bullet holes, just blind spots. No bullet holes, just blind spots. Nolan's name sat at the center, not as the villain, but as the symptom. The real story was the scaffolding that kept him standing for years. Supervisors who lost reports, clerks who filed complaints under incomplete, partners who saw bruises and looked away. It wasn't one man. It was a culture built on looking in the other direction and calling it procedure. The collapse wasn't loud. There were no alarms, no riots, just a quiet erosion of hierarchy, a dignity bankruptcy that spread from inboxes to interrogation rooms. What fell wasn't law enforcement, it was the illusion that it ever policed itself. Each resignation letter felt less like retreat and more like recoil. A recoil from years of enabling under the guise of the chain of command. Jaden watched the unraveling with no joy, no triumph, just a cold precision in his eyes, like watching a toxin slowly exit a bloodstream. He didn't speak publicly, he didn't post, but when asked by a reporter if he thought justice had begun, he answered simply, "It's not justice. It's accounting. We're just beginning to tally the debt." And Amara, she remained unreachable, yet omnipresent. Her name is no longer just a headline, but a mirror in every precinct. She didn't need to speak. The system was now choking on the very silence it once demanded from her, and as it splintered, groaned, and collapsed inward, it wasn't her fists that did the damage. It was her refusal to vanish. The silence that followed Nolan's public suspension was not peace. It was the hush of a storm gathering force. And when the storm spoke, it did not thunder. It hissed, sleeked through airwaves, leaked through screens. Its voice, Nolan's own. Desperation drives men like Nolan to mistake microphones for redemption. 2 days after his name was scrubbed from every departmental record, he re-emerged, not in uniform, but seated behind the low light of a fringe podcast, surrounded by hosts who wore smugness like a uniform of their own. The show's title? Badge and Backbone. Its tone? A sewer disguised as justice. There was no live audience, no official lighting rig, just the dim hum of a basement studio hidden between rows of shuttered stores. Yet in that stale, echoing room, Nolan sat as if he were reclaiming a throne, though it was a throne surrounded by peeling paint and unwashed mugs. As he adjusted the headset that barely clung to his thinning hair, a small drop of sweat slid from his temple down to the collar of a shirt once pressed with pride. Now wrinkled, stained, and forgotten by dry cleaners who had begun rejecting his name. One such shop in East Crestfield, where he'd been a regular for over a decade, posted a printed sign by the register: "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." The underline below "anyone" was heavy. Local patrons didn't need it explained. His badge, once held high to cut lines and silence complaints, had become an unspoken scarlet letter. The woman at the corner diner, who used to refill his coffee before the cup even reached the table, now avoided his gaze and placed his check face down with the tip line scratched out. No one told her to do it. She simply stopped, recognizing the entitlement in his voice. And yet, he spoke now as if none of that mattered, as if the world hadn't shifted beneath his boots. Nolan leaned forward, eyes bloodshot, voice shaking with the fragile bravado of a man clinging to what little illusion of control he still had. "I was set up," he spat. "That woman, Amara, this whole thing was a stunt. She wanted to provoke me, wanted to become a symbol, and they used me to make it happen." His hosts nodded with performative solemnity, feeding his delusion with cheap affirmations. "You're saying it was orchestrated? That she planned it?" Outside the building, someone had keyed a single word into the driver's side of his car: Stain. He saw it earlier that morning, parked between two other vehicles that had, for the past week, always left a single space of distance between themselves and his. It wasn't just vandalism, it was choreography, a quiet language of collective disapproval. At the pharmacy, a cashier hesitated before scanning his ID for a prescription, then asked if he still had insurance. When he said yes, she tilted her head and murmured, "For now." Her tone wasn't cruel, but it cut with the softness of someone already mourning the man he used to be. No mob had formed, no protests surrounded his home, but the erosion was steady, precise, like water carving through stone, silent but inevitable. He noticed it in the way people paused longer before opening doors for him, in the barista who asked for a name with each order, though she'd memorized his name years ago, in the slow freeze of routine recognition. Still, behind that microphone, he clung to the illusion of being understood, of being validated by the few who still fed off controversy like spoiled wine. He straightened in his seat as if the gesture could reclaim lost stature. The room smelled faintly of burnt dust and electrical tape, but Nolan exhaled with the relief of a man who believed he'd found sanctuary. The co-host in the leather jacket nodded again, cued in perfectly, and leaned into the mic. "So what you're saying is, this was never about misconduct? This was a witch hunt?" Nolan smirked, the same twisted upward curl that had once preceded the tearing of fabric. "Exactly. I've been targeted since day one for being a real cop. One who enforces the law." He didn't know the mic was still hot after they cut. He didn't realize the audio stream captured more than what aired, and he certainly didn't remember that, months before, in a locker room conversation, recorded for internal review but shelved without follow-up, he had bragged into the open air, "I tore her dress because she looked me in the eyes like she had power, like she forgot who runs the damn streets." Jayton did not post a word. He didn't shout into the digital void. He simply uploaded that old locker room file, unedited, uncaptioned, just a name, Nolan, and a date. The internet did the rest. In under an hour, the tag self-exposed burned through Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and every thread-stained corner of Reddit like napalm. Clips were spliced, overlaid with the moment Nolan said live on air, "I was set up," followed by his own, unmistakable voice snarling, "I tore her dress because she looked me in the eyes." There was no need for a narrator. The contrast was surgical. A lie and its proof. The file passed from phone to phone like contraband in plain sight, reposted in different languages, subtitled by strangers, broken down frame by frame, by digital sleuths who embedded the waveform into visual infographics. At a cafe in Midtown, a barista printed Nolan's quote on a coffee sleeve and passed it, without a word, to a journalist live streaming a reaction panel. In a university lecture hall, A professor of media ethics rewrote his entire syllabus over the weekend, replacing Week 7's assigned reading with the transcript and timeline of the locker room recording. His first lecture began not with a question, but with a single prompt projected across the screen. What happens when the mask isn't ripped off, but willingly removed? By Monday, a mural appeared overnight on the side of an abandoned subway station wall. Nolan's face spliced with the waveform of his voice, his mouth open, not in defiance, but in decay, lips dissolving into jagged lines of recorded guilt. Beneath it, in spray-painted gold, "Not all confessions need an interrogation." The mural was untouched for days, not out of reverence, but because no one in the neighborhood wanted to be seen scrubbing away what had already become communal gospel. On the train that passed that station, a conductor quietly skipped announcements at that stop. He let the silence ring longer between stations. A passenger filmed it and added the caption, "We're letting him sit with it." That clip gained over 3 million views in 12 hours. Meanwhile, Nolan was unaware of the reach, still sheltered in the stale basement of the podcast studio, surrounded by hosts who no longer returned his texts. When he did step outside, shaved, dressed in business casual, attempting a return to errands, a teenager at a convenience store filmed him buying a bottle of water, not for mockery, but for the quiet discomfort captured in his eyes as he realized every aisle was empty. No one pushed past him. No one greeted him. Even the cashier, who knew his face from countless TV reports, scanned the item without speaking and turned the screen around, refusing eye contact. The boy captured the clip. "This is what guilt without cuffs looks like." It trended under the tag, "Silent Receipt." Within 48 hours, Nolan's name was no longer a headline, it was an echo, multiplying without control, picked up not by official voices, but by those who had long since lost faith in official statements. In a town hall meeting in Oak Ridge, a woman whose niece had once filed an unheeded complaint against Nolan raised her hand and read the locker room quote aloud, her voice steady, unforgiving, and punctuated not by tears, but by the tapping of her fingernail against the table. Someone in the back recorded the moment. That tap became the soundtrack of 1,000 other videos that week. Videos of young women recounting encounters with authority figures who spoke in the same tone, wielded the same threats, believed they too ran the damn streets. News anchors debated the ethics of releasing internal recordings. Civil rights attorneys responded by reading Nolan's quote into the public record during a panel, ensuring it was archived, not for punishment but for preservation. By Friday evening, a sculpture stood in the center of a plaza in downtown Greenville, a dress carved from wire, elevated on a steel pedestal, eyes engraved along the hemline, all open, all watching. No plaque, no name, just the weight of memory turned into art. Nolan's defense had become its undoing, a self-mandarin dissection of arrogance mistaken for power, a defense and its demolition. And the public? It didn't need coaching anymore. Fury had grown teeth. Within 24 hours, the podcast was mass reported. Within 48 hours, it disappeared. Streaming services purged the episode, and platforms distanced themselves from the host. One of the co-hosts tried to pivot, tweeting, "We didn't know the full story." The ratio on that post could have buried a city. Meanwhile, legal weight descended like the Women's Justice Forum, a powerhouse of legal advocacy for victims of gender-based violence, filed a civil action against Nolan for defamation and incitement. Their filing quoted both clips, what he said on air and what he thought no one would ever hear. They called it with sharp precision a double-layered violation of dignity, assault in action and assault in narrative. Nolan tried to release a clarification, a pale, half-hearted paragraph posted to a burner account where he claimed he had been misinterpreted, that the clip was out of context, that the tone was locker room humor, but his cadence betrayed him. There is no context in which the word tear sounds accidental. There is no joke in watching power flex over vulnerability. Public opinion napkin didn't shift, it solidified. Even those previously silent have now added their voices, not out of trend but out of moral imperative. Professors of law shared the case in classrooms. In a small town outside Denver, a teacher printed the transcript and read it aloud during a civics lesson, pausing only once when a student raised her hand and asked why no one stopped him. The room fell silent not because they lacked answers, but because the question had come too late. Elsewhere, a mural appeared on the glass facade of a youth center, an open mouth with a red line carved diagonally through it. The quote Nolan had tried to walk back was painted across the sidewalk leading to the building, each word set in cracked gold paint, weatherproofed by resolve, not approval. The mural stayed up until a city official ordered it covered, but by then the image had already gone viral, reshared by thousands under the caption, "We heard you the first time." In a cafe in Tallahassee, a woman placed a paper napkin beside her espresso, then unfolded it to reveal the waveform of Nolan's voice, traced by hand in ballpoint pen. She passed it to a journalist who had been speaking too loudly about both sides, then left without finishing her drink. The image made its way to a zine that specialized in social justice art, and within hours the hand-drawn napkin was auctioned online, with proceeds pledged to a domestic abuse shelter. Nolan's image, once shielded by the badge, now hangs in digital galleries under titles like The Echo of Authority and Words as Wounds. A bookstore in Portland redesigned its front display, removing bestsellers to make room for a single curated wall, books on ethics, structural violence, and a new print of the Constitution, annotated by civil rights lawyers. Taped above the shelf was a still frame of Nolan's face mid-sentence, jaw twisted in mid-denial, eyes not meeting the camera. No caption, just the date of the recording. Customers didn't need context. They paused, they read, they remembered. And in a high school tucked behind an overpass in Milwaukee, where the walls still bore scuffs from decades of overlooked budgets, the debate team gathered after school to dissect the entire clip line by line. Their coach, a soft-spoken former prosecutor, let the students lead. They parsed Nolan's phrasing, tone, and posture, weighing his claims against the grainy truth of his confession. No one interrupted. No one laughed. When the session ended, a sophomore stood and wrote 3 words on the board before leaving. He said it. The chalk smudged slightly as she walked away, but the meaning didn't blur. High school debate clubs tore the clip apart for rhetorical contradiction. Advocacy groups launched educational drives titled When Justice Outs Itself. And through it all, Amara remained untouched by the noise. She issued no statements. She gave no interviews. Her silence was not absence, it was an assertion. Because when your abuser convicts himself, what more is there to say? Jaden, ever the architect of quiet force, did issue one tweet. It read, "Some men build walls to hide behind. Some build microphones." He mistook an audience for amnesty. No hashtag, no taglines. Just that. The next morning, cable news showed Nolan, gray-faced and incoherent, being escorted out of a hotel lobby after being denied entry to a press briefing he once would have dominated. No camera zoomed in. No journalist followed up. His story had lost the only fuel it had left, attention. And that was the final blow. Not a punch, not a trial, not a sentence, but a collapse into irrelevance, triggered not by the crowd, but by his own need to be heard. In the hours that followed, he tried to re-enter spaces that had once received him without hesitation. The community hall where he had spoken at youth summits now had a quiet memo pinned to the front door, written in blue ink by hand and laminated. All guests must be approved before entry. His name was never mentioned, but the implication clung to the walls like the scent of old policy. He passed a mural once, dedicated to officers who had contributed to neighborhood safety. His likeness had been painted near the corner, just above the line of children's handprints. Now, someone had delicately painted over his face with a bloom of opaque white, not in anger, but but in quiet reclamation, as though the wall itself had decided it no longer wished to remember him. At a library downtown, tucked inside a civic archive, a researcher cataloging recent cultural flashpoints had boxed a series of printouts for preservation. In one folder sat a now famous screenshot, Nolan's face, mid-sentence during his podcast appearance, frozen in a moment of denial. The archivist had labeled it unintentional truth. A middle school art teacher in New Jersey printed that frame in black and white and asked her class to sketch over it, creating alternative expressions. One student drew a single tear, another a tape strip across his mouth, a third outlined flames in the background. With no fire on Nolan himself, just a figure slowly fading into smoke. Images of those student sketches appeared in a viral post captioned, "When we learn to listen to lies like their warnings." The post sparked a trend, and within 3 days, hundreds of reinterpretations surfaced. Digital renderings, clay figures, even a stencil painted on the sidewalks near city halls in 4 states. Each was anonymous, each had the same hollow eyes. He tried to enter a restaurant on the edge of downtown, one he had frequented for years, where his badge had once secured him the best table without a wait. But this time the hostess stared at him too long, blinked, and asked for a reservation. When he replied with his name, she paused again, nodded, and said, "Sorry, we're fully booked." The table beside her was empty. Behind him, a couple waiting in line recognized his voice and turned away in synchronized discomfort. Someone recorded the interaction from across the street. No dialogue was needed. The clip's silence was the statement. It trended under the tag, "Reserved for accountability." He called a rideshare after that. 2 drivers accepted and canceled. A third pulled up, looked at him through the window, and kept driving. The 4th finally stopped but didn't speak the entire ride, not even to ask where he was going. That silence hurt more than slurs. It was the erasure of relevance, the acknowledgement that his presence no longer demanded explanation, only avoidance. One night, a candlelight vigil appeared outside a courthouse, not for Nolan, but for victims of state overreach. Someone read aloud the full transcript of his recording, not with outrage, but with clinical precision, each word held up like an exhibit. No chants, no jeers, just names, dates, and syllables spoken with surgical clarity. A line of shoes was placed beneath the courthouse steps, some torn, some polished, all empty. One bore a note that read, "This is where unchecked power walks us." The photo of that line of shoes appeared on the front page of 3 newspapers, each without headlines. None needed them. The framing had become universal. His voice was now more quoted than questioned, more dissected than defended. In lecture halls, it became a cautionary soundbite. In essays, a rhetorical pivot point. In parodies, a bitter punchline. His intonation, once deployed to control, now existed only as a warning sign for those learning how control sounds before it becomes cruelty. The lesson, etched in the public mind, was chilling in its symmetry. Nolan had once stripped a woman of dignity to assert his authority. Now, with his own words, he stripped himself of credibility forever. The world didn't need to shout to bring him down. He did it for them, 1 syllable at a time. The lesson, etched in the public mind, was chilling in its symmetry. Nolan had once stripped a woman of dignity to assert his authority. Now, with his own words, he stripped himself of credibility forever. The world didn't need to shout to bring him down. He did it for them, 1 syllable at a time. But even as the public laid down their verdict, the court, bound by the brittle bones of existing statutes, reached a conclusion that failed to echo the nation's fury. The ruling came not in a thunderous declaration, but through the dry breath of legal phrasing. Nolan had violated ethical boundaries. His actions were reprehensible, but under current criminal law, they did not constitute an indictable offense. The courtroom did not erupt. It recoiled. Reporters lowered their pens not out of relief, but confusion. Murmurs echoed like cracks in glass, each whisper a splinter of disbelief. Amara, dressed in a crisp slate suit without insignia, without embellishment, stepped out of the courthouse flanked by no one, protected by no shield of press advisors or legal guards. She walked straight through the parting sea of reporters, unbothered by the way microphones angled toward her without warning. She stopped only once, at the center of the marble steps, and lifted her chin toward the wall of lenses. Her voice was not raised, her words did not tremble. "The law isn't enough, not yet, but we will make it enough." That was all she said. That was all she needed to say. The silence that followed was not uncertainty, it was acknowledgement. Inside, Nolan sat on the bench behind his counsel, his back against the polished wooden rail, his posture attempting defiance but sagging under the weight of something more corrosive than guilt, visibility. The cameras didn't linger on him as they once did. The courtroom sketch showed him with diluted features, no longer sharp, no longer certain, a man drawn in fading ink. When he attempted to sign up for a public reintegration program weeks later, designed for dismissed officers and displaced civil servants, the rejection email arrived before his browser tab even refreshed. The reasoning was short, clinical, final. Applicant deemed incompatible with community-focused rehabilitation. No indicators of reformative potential. He printed the email and brought it to a veterans center in Hopewell, hoping to find refuge in uniformed brotherhood. But the man at the front desk, a retired sergeant with silver thread hair and a spine that still held, read the letter, recognized the name, and returned it without a word. That center later launched a national fundraising drive to support victims of public misconduct. In its opening banner, over an image of folded flags and unspoken grief, was a line that spread like wildfire across social platforms. "We support the broken, never the ones who do the breaking." Within the first 72 hours, the campaign raised $2,300,000, 0 cents. One comment beneath the announcement read simply, "Not 1 cent for Nolan." It became a chant, then a slogan, then a sticker pressed on the backs of laptops, windshields, and protest drums. Jaden posted again, not often, not loudly, but with the weight of a man who didn't need repetition to be heard. His message was a single sentence, typed in stark white on a charcoal background. Forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is freedom from the hands of the cruel. It was shared over 100,000 times in 3 days, translated into 5 languages by strangers who had never met Amara, never spoken to Jaden, but understood the resonance of unspoken solidarity. Meanwhile, Nolan remained free, technically, but doors no longer opened for him. Jobs, even those unrelated to enforcement, quietly ghosted his applications. A position managing inventory for a warehouse chain closed its posting minutes after he submitted his resume. A teaching assistant role at a small Fornono college replied with an apology and a footnote referencing recent public history not aligning with institutional values. Even silence had begun to speak, in phrases tailored to push him further into absence. He moved twice in 1 month, not from threat but from atmosphere. In his old neighborhood, children had started tracing his face onto sidewalks with chalk, then stomping it out before sunset. One parent filmed the act and posted it as an accidental capture. The background audio, faint but biting, featured one child asking, "He can't hurt anyone, right?" and another answering, "No, he talks too much now." The city no longer flinched at his name. It simply ignored it. Reporters who once begged for exclusive quotes began refusing to mention him at all, not out of policy but fatigue. His narrative had expired. The arc had closed. And in that void, the absence of redemption became a sentence far sharper than prison. There was no parole for cultural rejection, no appeal for erasure by relevance. The final echo of his relevance came not through defiance, but a dull attempt at appeal. He posted a video, unlisted but leaked, where he sat in front of a dim lamp, lips dry, eyes darting, and asked for understanding, not forgiveness, just understanding. The comment section filled not with hate, but with quotes. His own words, thrown back at him like stones wrapped in velvet. "I tore her dress. She looked me in the eyes. I was set up." Line after line, timed like clockwork. And beneath all of them, pinned by a user with no profile picture, was Amara's sentence. "We will make it enough." There was no violence in his downfall, no courtroom finale, no gavel-slamming epilogue, just the accumulation of rejection, like snowfall over rooftops until structures sagged without sound. Just the weight of a name that once wielded fear, now evoking nothing at all. He walked through streets that had memorized his disgrace, not through sirens, through stillness. He passed windows that no longer reflected him. He heard his name only in fragments, whispered behind doors he would never enter again. The trial had ended, but the sentencing, the true one, stretched quietly into every day that followed. Unwritten, unclaimed, unrelenting. And he bore it not because he chose to, but because there was no one left to carry it for him. He had stripped others to feel powerful. Now, with his own words, he stripped himself of credibility forever. The world didn't need to shout to bring him down. He did it for them, one syllable at a time. It started with a flyer that appeared overnight at a local college campus. Someone had taken stills from Nolan's leaked video, cropped them tightly around his mouth, and arranged them beside the waveform of his infamous confession. No title, just the silent suggestion that the face and the sound were forever fused. The flyer spread beyond the bulletin boards, reprinted by students and pasted on lampposts, bar bathrooms, and lockers. By noon, it was used as a protest poster in a nearby town hall meeting, held up by a student whose sister once filed a complaint against another officer and never heard back. Her sign didn't mention Nolan by name, but her eyes did. They searched every camera in the room with a quiet challenge, and as the image circulated online, the caption that took hold wasn't one of anger, but of finality. "He spoke enough." We listened. At a subway entrance in another city, an anonymous artist installed a sound sculpture made of cheap speakers arranged in a semicircle. Each one whispered the same line Nolan had spoken. "She looked me in the eyes," on loop, barely audible unless you stood inside the circle. People lined up to step in and listen. Some emerged with frowns, others with tears. Most said nothing. A journalist covering the installation later tweeted a simple observation: "You only have to hear it once to know how many times she did." The sculpture was taken down after a week, but someone had already recorded it. The recording spread faster than the art ever could. Its quietness became its power. Meanwhile, a small-town bookstore with no website and barely enough foot traffic to stay open began refusing service to anyone associated with Nolan. This didn't need a press release. A single photo, taken by a passerby, showed the handwritten sign taped to the inside of the window: "We do not sell silence to those who weaponize it." The post was shared, debated, praised, and criticized. But no one asked for it to be taken down. The silence that followed the post felt heavier than protest. Later that month, a neighborhood watch meeting in Nolan's former precinct held a moment of recognition, not of his service, but of its cost. The meeting minutes, usually dry and procedural, included a section labeled "Lessons Carved in Stone." Under it were just 2 bullet points. The first read, "Uniform does not equal trust." The second, a direct quote from Nolan's locker room confession. The inclusion wasn't discussed aloud, but no one asked for it to be removed. Copies of the minutes circulated far beyond the neighborhood, posted to forums and public threads where readers underlined the irony of a man once sworn to protect, now reduced to a cautionary clause in civic paperwork. By then, even the satire had grown sharper. A local comedy group known for political skits performed a silent act, just a man sitting under a single light, mouthing Nolan's lines as they played faintly from a cracked speaker. The audience laughed, but it was a laughter laced with unease, a release of pressure too long held. A reviewer later called the performance a portrait of a man trapped in his echo. Clips from the act were reposted with the tag "Echo Chamber Justice," turning Nolan's attempt at defense into a looped performance of exposure. And still, Nolan walked the streets. He went to grocery stores and found cereal boxes with his image taped over by patrons wielding makeshift stickers. He entered a bank and noticed the teller's name tag had been turned backward, as if refusing to share identity in a space where he once flaunted his. He ordered coffee and received a cup with no name, no receipt, and no eye contact. These were not protests. They were rituals of forgetting. Deliberate, restrained, relentless. At night, the video he had posted to reclaim his voice haunted him. From other people's screens. It became a tool for workshops, trainings, and college presentations on ethical collapse. His face was no longer recognizable because of power, but because of failure. Students paused at mid-frame and dissected posture, timing, and syntax. It was no longer about him, it was about what he represented, and in that symbolic erasure, he ceased to matter. He had stripped others to feel powerful. Now, with his own words, he stripped himself of credibility forever. The world didn't need to shout to bring him down. He did it for them, one syllable at a time. He had stripped others to feel powerful. Now, with his own words, he stripped himself of credibility forever. The world didn't need to shout to bring him down. He did it for them, one syllable at a time. And while the echo of his collapse dissipated through vacant headlines and closed tabs, somewhere else, in a hall neither grand nor austere, but quietly hallowed by its purpose, Amara stood at the threshold of a different kind of stage. No orchestra played, no announcer called her name. The air shifted only because those within it had agreed without instruction, without cue, that silence was the highest form of welcome. One by one, attendees rose from their seats, not as a wave, but as a slow, reverent ascent, the way dawn light rises across stone. Their applause did not erupt. It gathered the way truth does when no one tries to sell it. She stepped into view beneath the halo of the overhead lights, wearing a white dress, identical in cut, in texture, in presence, to the one torn from her dignity months before. But now, along the seams once split by shame, golden thread glistened like the healing of a wound not hidden but honored. There were no glittering logos on her bodice, no sculpted embellishments, just fabric that whispered resilience, movement that defied the memory of stillness. Her steps made no sound, yet every footfall seemed to imprint something permanent upon the polished floor, as if gravity itself yielded to her purpose. She did not stop at the center of the stage. She did not speak. She turned, slowly, one full circle, her skirt lifting gently with the arc of her motion, the light catching on the gold threads with the precision of ceremony. The silence did not break, it held. On the back wall of the stage, lit only by a single soft beam, the words appeared as if summoned from breath. She doesn't need to shout, because everyone has already heard. A journalist in the third row lowered her camera. A retired judge on the balcony stood with his hand against his chest. A 10-year-old girl sitting between two foster parents whispered something unintelligible, then wiped her eyes on her sleeve. No one moved to explain the moment. No one tried to frame it with commentary. The silence stretched into reverence. Later that evening, the white dress, still marked with faint signs of its origin beneath the ornate stitching, was displayed on a sculpted frame inside a tempered glass case, beside a brass placard that read only, "Not replaced, restored." At the closing ceremony, the dress was announced as the centerpiece of a charity auction. All proceeds would go toward the creation of a scholarship fund for survivors of law enforcement violence. The starting bid was $10. Within an hour, it exceeded $300,000. The final offer came from a donor who requested anonymity but left a note that read, "This dress cost her nothing, but it gave us back everything." Jaden did not take the stage with grandeur. He walked down the aisle like a man returning from war. Not to be celebrated, but to bring something sacred home. In his hand was a velvet-lined case, unmarked, except for the emblem of the International Martial Alliance etched into its steel clasp. He opened it beside her as she stood still in the spotlight, revealing a medallion rarely seen, never casually bestowed. It was the honor of enduring spirit, a distinction created for warriors who had never stepped into a ring, but whose fight had reshaped what combat meant. Amara became the first non-combatant, the first civilian, the first woman, and the first survivor to receive it. Jayden did not speak when he placed it over her shoulders. He simply looked at her, then stepped back. The lights dimmed, not to end the moment, but to protect it. No hashtags were trending that night, no viral sound bites cut for digital theater. But by morning, the image of Amara in that white dress, its hem edged with gold, the medal resting just below her collarbone, had been shared by mothers, teachers, poets, and strangers who had never known her name until it was no longer necessary to pronounce it. In classrooms, students pointed to the screen and said, "That's strength." In forums, the phrase, "she doesn't need to shout," became a quiet signature, a line people typed beneath stories of survival and justice long delayed. One user posted the photo beside a caption that read, "This is how you reclaim what they thought they ruined." Outside the venue, someone chalked a single sentence onto the sidewalk, where hundreds had walked without noticing the ground. "White is not what she wore, it's what she turned into light." No one erased it, not even the rain. Inside, long after the guests had left and the flowers had been collected, the stage remained lit by a single beam. Beneath it, the podium was untouched. No voice had needed it, no anger had filled it, and still it felt heavier than any speech ever delivered. The medal glinted under the amber wash of closing light. It was not a trophy, it was testimony. And the white dress, behind glass, breathed like something still becoming. Her silence had never been surrendered. It had always been strategy. The world watched, and this time it did not blink. The medal glinted under the amber wash of closing light. It was not a trophy, it was testimony. And the white dress, behind glass, breathed like something still becoming. Her silence had never been surrendered. It had always been strategy. The world watched, and this time it did not blink. Elsewhere, in rooms where applause never reached and curtains never lifted, Nolan moved like residue, not erased but evicted, not exiled by force but vacuumed from relevance. His name had become a shadow stretched too thin to cast, not censored, not forbidden, just unused. The media stopped updating his whereabouts, newsrooms dropped his tags from metadata, forums that once erupted with his mentions quietly let them sink to the bottom, buried beneath newer flame. No trending, no echo, no recall. Even Wikipedia flagged his entry as non-notable. He changed his name twice. The first time to something unremarkable, something almost kind. The second time after a hotel manager recognized him from a photo and asked him, kindly but firmly, to leave before noon. He dyed his hair, grew facial hair, moved to another county, then another state. But wherever he went, silence followed. Not the kind that forgives, but the kind that closes doors without explanation. Leasing agents rescinded offers after running background checks. Barbers turned away walk-ins with no appointments. One diner, after serving him once, simply stopped opening on the day he returned. At a self-serve car wash 3 towns south of where he used to live, a stranger called out his name by mistake, thinking he was someone else, someone they knew from a different shame. When Nolan turned, the man flinched, paused, then flung the bucket of gray water in his hands, not out of fury, but revulsion. The incident wasn't caught on camera. No hashtags followed, but the scent of soap and motor oil clung to Nolan's jacket for days, as if the air itself refused to forget. He tried to issue another apology online, a short, stammered video with shaking hands and vacant eyes. He didn't cry, he didn't defend, he only asked, again, to be understood. The post stayed up for weeks, no comments, no shares, just a counter ticking views with the steady indifference of a machine. A void measured in numbers, not engagement. It was worse than being hated. It was being seen as and decided unworthy of a response. Attempts to apply for work met silence that needed no punctuation. The state licensing board that once certified him now returned his inquiries with form letters. One national database listed him as former employee, status inapplicable. His previous supervisor, when contacted by a prospective employer, allegedly said, "I have no memory of that man." The record was not expunged, it was amputated. No agency wanted to absorb the liability. No HR system system wanted his file. His name no longer came with a past. It came with weight. In quiet desperation, he mailed resumes to community colleges, night shifts, storage units, mailroom positions. None replied. One automated system sent him a receipt reading, "Entry not recognized." It became a meme in underground circles, a screen grab labeled, "When even the system ghosts you." Online, his name drifted toward algorithmic extinction. Searches began to pull unrelated results. Even YouTube, once saturated with remixes of his downfall, had begun returning music videos with unrelated titles. He wasn't scrubbed, he was diluted. One user called it the slow dissolve of the undeserving. Meanwhile, in an interview she never gave, Amara released only a single line. Not a statement, not a headline, just a post, untagged, unembellished, written in a serif font on a white background. When justice is done right, the villain doesn't need remembering. It was screenshotted, reshared, translated, handwritten on notebooks, and carved into park benches. No one needed to ask whom she meant. And Nolan, seated in an apartment that no longer received mail, looked out a window that faced another wall in a building where neighbors didn't ask names and landlords didn't renew leases, saw nothing. Not rage, not redemption, just the fog of a presence unrequested. His phone rang less. His inbox was filled only with spam. The world hadn't turned against him, it had outgrown him. His silence now was not strategic, it was survival. But no one hunted him, no one searched. His disappearance didn't warrant closure, because closure requires a wound to begin with. What he left behind was not trauma, it was a dull stain, wiped clean without ceremony. He tried once to attend a public event under a false name, a lecture on law enforcement ethics. He sat in the back, said nothing, took no notes. But halfway through, the presenter displayed a slide, his face blurred, his quote intact. The audience froze. One woman turned, just one. She looked at him, then turned back. He left during intermission. Not because anyone followed, but because no one did. In the weeks that followed, his file was archived deeper into digital oblivion. No journalist chased his trail. No podcast speculated on his silence. No documentary sought him for the other side. He was not censored, he was complete. And somewhere, far from the life he once claimed, he sat on a plastic chair with chipped legs, in a room that smelled of microwave meals and artificial pine, watching a muted television cycle through news he was no longer a part of. The volume knob was broken, but the silence, somehow, was louder than it had ever been. The first sign of that silence came not in words, but in an algorithm. A search bar that, when typed slowly with trembling fingers, no longer offered his name after the third letter. The platform, once filled with reels of his downfall, now suggested baking recipes and cat videos instead. A user somewhere in a comment thread called it algorithmic absolution, but it wasn't absolution. It was an absence coded into convenience. Then came the bookstore shelf that once carried a dozen volumes about justice and policing. A volunteer reorganized them by theme, placing stories of survival and resistance at eye level. A regular visitor noticed the missing title, one that had once quoted Nolan by name, and when they asked, the clerk answered, "That edition's out of circulation." The clerk wasn't being political. She was being literal. The distributor had quietly stopped printing it 6 weeks earlier. Then came the sidewalk, not the one near his old home, which had long been scrubbed of chalk outlines and protest residue. This was in a neighborhood 3 cities away, where he had passed one afternoon in anonymity, thinking the reach of memory would not extend beyond zip codes. Someone recognized him, not a scream, not a confrontation, just a stare long enough to gather weight. By the time he reached the bus stop, a sticker had been placed on the back of the bench, a black square with white text. "Some people vanish because we let them." It was not addressed to anyone, but it followed him. Photos of it surfaced online, tagged in vague posts. Not accusations, just reflections of consequence. He applied for a permit to work as a security consultant. The office receptionist greeted him politely, took his papers, and then asked him to wait. 15 minutes later, a supervisor emerged with a smile that tried to be kind and a clipboard that did not. "There's a delay in verification," they said. "We'll call you." No call came. A week later, he returned and found a different receptionist, one who didn't recognize his new name but flinched slightly when she saw his ID. She didn't refuse him, she just said, "The system's down today." When he checked the state's portal, the application's status read, "Withdrawn by user." He hadn't withdrawn it. At a gas station near the border, he tried to pay with cash and was told they were out of change. The clerk didn't smile, didn't scowl, just looked at him like a name no longer matching any file. The car behind honked, not at him, but at the stillness he caused. He moved aside. The receipt was printed blank. On a public forum once filled with debates about his case, a user posted a question. What happened to him? No one answered. The thread received 2 likes, then drifted. When he Googled himself a week later, his images showed up only in archived snapshots, cached and fragmented. The captions beneath had been auto-translated, mismatched, and occasionally labeled him as someone else entirely. He clicked on one and landed on a 404 page. The erasure was not precise, it was passive. It did not strike, it receded. In a grocery store in the town where he now rented a room above a tire shop, he reached for a can on a high shelf and dropped it. The sound startled a child nearby. Her mother picked her up and whispered something in her ear. The child looked at him, not afraid, just unsure, and when he bent down to replace the can, she had already turned her head, not to him, just away. On his nightstand lay a copy of a local newspaper, unopened. The front page carried a story about a new training program for young officers, emphasizing dignity and de-escalation. The article did not mention him, did not cite him, did not even allude to the history that made such programs necessary. The article did not owe him a memory. It owed the future its clarity. In the hallway outside his door, someone taped a notice asking residents to respect quiet hours. The note was underlined twice. He hadn't made noise. No one accused him of anything. But when he stepped into the corridor the next morning, the paper was gone and a faint scrape of tape remained on his neighbor's door, not his. He read the absence like a sentence. He stopped checking his inbox after realizing most unread messages were subscription renewals for accounts he no longer had access to. He tried resetting passwords and was met with a prompt that read, "We don't recognize this user." It was not a security measure. It was the shape of forgetting written in code. The muted television still played, its colors flickering across his face like ghosts of commentary he would never be part of again. A headline scrolled across the bottom, something about policy or protest or people rising, but he couldn't read it. The screen was cracked. The remote was missing. The volume knob was broken, but the silence somehow was louder than it had ever been. The volume knob was broken, but the silence somehow was louder than it had ever been. And yet, across town, in a place where silence had once meant something entirely different, another quiet began to unfold. Not out of neglect, not from dismissal, but born of completion. It was not erasure, it was a return. Jaden and Amara walked side by side without announcement, without escorts or media, under a sky that had long since stopped demanding headlines. The shopping mall stood unchanged in form, but something in its posture had shifted, like a building that had finally been forced to listen. The stone tiles beneath their feet were the same, but the echoes no longer sounded like dread. The hallway they entered still smelled faintly of wax and air conditioning, but above the archway a new sign had been installed. "This is a safe zone. 360 DG, surveillance active." No one stood to greet them. No cameras waited to capture their steps. It was just a Thursday afternoon where the air was thick with nothing but its ordinary weight. As they passed the corridor where everything once unraveled, a security guard in a neatly pressed uniform glanced up from his station. His eyes met Amara's for a split second, then dropped. Not out of defiance, not from fear, but from an awareness too complicated to fit into a nod. He bowed slightly, not in ritual but in recognition, then turned away as if shielding her from the embarrassment of being seen too clearly. She did not return the gesture. She didn't need to. Jayden paused by the bench near the atrium, the same bench where he had once tightened his jaw and clenched his hands. Today, he sat calmly. Slowly, deliberately, he took off his wedding ring, wiped the inside surface with the edge of his shirt, and slipped it back onto his finger. The gesture was not one of correction, but clarity. Nothing had been broken. It had only needed cleansing. Amara stood a few paces away, still facing the same glass storefront that had once mirrored the worst hour of her life. Her dress, again white, again sleeveless, again simple, danced gently around her knees as a crosswind crept through the open end of the hall. She didn't speak. There was no need. The fabric moved like water over truth, flowing without resistance. One by one, shoppers passed without interruption. Some too young to know, some too wise to pretend they didn't. But no one interrupted. No one whispered. One elderly woman pushing a cart stopped briefly and nodded. It was the kind of nod reserved for monuments, not people. They remained there for long minutes. Not to make a point, not to relive anything, but to mark the place with something that could not be stripped away. Presence. Jayden leaned back slightly, his shoulders unburdened, his gaze steady but uninvested. He did not scan for threats. He no longer needed to protect anything. He had already won the kind of battle that left no bruises but restructured the ground it was fought. The floor beneath them, once scuffed by rushing feet and scattered with gasps, had been resurfaced. The overhead lights, once harsh and fluorescent, had been replaced with soft LEDs that made no promises but offered no cruelty. A small plaque mounted beneath a potted plant near the entrance read, "Revised under Public Integrity Mandate 2025. No signatures, no dedication, just a date and a shift." A mother walked by with her son. The boy pointed at Amara's dress, then asked a question too quiet to catch. The mother bent down, whispered back, then took his hand and kept walking. There was no reverence in their pace, no sorrow in their tone, just acknowledgement wrapped in daily rhythm. In the distance, an intercom buzzed a sale alert from a tech store, unremarkable, unchanged, background noise reclaiming its place. Jayden glanced sideways at Amara, but didn't speak. She turned to meet his eyes, just for a moment, and smiled. Not wide, not performative, but full. They began to walk again, retracing the path they had taken that first day, not to commemorate, but to close. The corridor seemed longer now, but its edges felt softer, as if the very architecture had learned to yield. As they passed beneath the former security checkpoint, now replaced with an art installation featuring a once-torn dress woven with golden repairs, a short video taken earlier by a shopper from a second-story railing replayed across a discrete screen mounted nearby. That video, silent except for ambient crowd noise, had gone viral months ago, under the tag Healing Corridor, garnering millions of views for its gentle tension, not because something dramatic happened, but because nothing did. That still frame of amorous posture, hands folded calmly at her waist, had flicked across screens globally, prompting commentary about power reclaimed through tranquility. Moments later, as their footsteps echoed softly on polished stone, a screen in a nearby cafe showed the image of a bench. The same bench where Jayden had once knelt to steady himself before intervening. Someone had turned the bench into a small memorial, fresh flowers placed at its base under the caption, "Quiet Courage," shared hundreds of times on social media by people who'd never visited the mall. As Jayden and Amara passed, a barista who recognized Amara paused behind the counter, offering a nod so slight that only those looking closely would notice the warmth in her eyes. That gesture, captured by a customer on a pocket camera, became another viral moment, tagged "No of Respect." And it wasn't a protest. It was a reclamation of dignity in the simplest form. Even the mall's music system contributed unwittingly. As they walked past a mid-mall kiosk, a soft piano song hummed through speakers. Someone later posted a video clip of that exact moment, captioned, "Her walk makes the notes whole again." It wasn't poetic contrivance. It was the quiet power of context. Just sunlight falling over her dress and a melody that matched the moment, turning absence of words into resonance. Observatory cameras intended for security now recorded that no one approached them. No flashbulbs, no intrusive questions. A short viral clip framed the scene from overhead. Viewers later commenting how unusual it was to see two people occupy public space without drawing crowds. That calm was itself remarkable in a world conditioned to spectacle. As they neared the exit, the space cleared, leaving only the pair and the emptiness that had been prepared to receive them, not with ceremony, but with acceptance. Jayton paused once more at the threshold, his hand resting on the glass, as if feeling its cool surface would seal the journey they'd completed. Amara reflected that hand with hers, their palms separated by only safety glass, yet connected by purpose. A security guard at the door met his gaze and nodded briefly, not in deference to authority, but in acknowledgement of presence. It was a nod that carried the weight of policy, empathy, and quiet validation. They stepped outside into a calm afternoon that smelled of still warm pavement and distant traffic. A single gust of wind caught Amara's dress, lifting it so that the gold thread shimmered against white, creating veins of light across the fabric. In that wind, they found a moment of pause before moving on. The threshold closed behind them with a gentle thud, not dramatic, but definitive. Each footstep left no trace, but every echo of their passage said something that couldn't be unsaid. By the time they reached the revolving doors at the exit, the wind outside had picked up slightly, enough to lift the hem of Amara's dress again, just as it had that day, but this time without shame. Her silhouette in the glass reflected not a victim, not even a survivor, but someone beyond either word, someone unchanged and yet utterly different. She looked back only once, then stepped forward into the open light. The door closed behind them without sound. The guard watched them go, then returned to his post without thought. The hallway filled again with the mundane rituals of retail, unaware it had just hosted something closer to absolution than justice. There were no speeches, no announcements, no live streams, but somewhere in a classroom a teacher showed a photo of Amara sitting silently in that corridor. Somewhere in a courtroom, a young clerk wrote her name into a policy draft. Somewhere in a poem, someone rhymed her silence with dignity. And somewhere deeper, where outrage had once lived, peace took root. Not loud, not brittle, but woven like the gold thread in a dress that had once been torn and now held everything together without asking to be noticed. During that same afternoon, a local coffee shop displayed an uncaptioned image of that corridor on its digital menu board. No explanation, just the empty hallway and the words, "She was here," and the video captured by a regular customer quietly circulated overnight, accruing hundreds of thousands of plays under the hashtag #PresenceNotPerformance, without a caption or comment. On a city bus, an advert folded into the route schedule played a silent loop. Amara's silhouette walking slowly through the corridor, triggering conversation among riders who shared grainy phone recordings labeled "She Walked It Back." In a public park, a group of volunteers installed a small stone bench engraved with just one date, the day Amara returned. No other words. Yet footage of people sitting there, heads bowed, went viral on the local news site the following morning. A neighborhood blog posted a photo of the bench at dawn, with dew droplets catching the wordless date, prompting an entire thread of reflections on what it meant when someone returned not to protest, but to reclaim. Meanwhile, a subway station near the mall began transmitting a silent digital billboard loop, showing the same corridor lighted at dusk. Faint ambient music accompanied the imagery, but passengers later reported feeling a gentle hush fall over the car, a momentary collective pause that trended online as mall moment. In that current of quiet reclamation, something unprecedented happened. Amara's return, her measured passage through what once imprisoned her memory, was not documented for headlines, but archived in effect. Communities treated her presence not as a spectacle, but as a signal, carrying viral tension not through outrage, but through collective hush. No anger, just a resonance. The resonance There was no fury in these gestures, just accumulation. They were viral in their restraint and minimalism, fractal in that each act reflected the previous, yet distinct, like ripples from a silent stone dropped into still water. No one called for hashtags. No public figure retweeted them. The acts themselves became statements. Meanwhile, Nolan remained absent, his name vaporized as a cautionary footnote, his attempted return ignored amid the currents of present celebrating something far more potent than notice. And within that silence, justice revealed its form, not as a shout, but as a constellation of small, interconnected acknowledgments, each one a thread in the web of collective refusal to forget differently. It was a justice that rewrote itself in the gestures of strangers and the hush of shared recognition, not in sentences or sounds, but in space reclaimed. It taught that true power lies not in the noise of correction, but in the quiet of acknowledgement and the resonance that follows. And as the last shaft of daylight hit the marble just where she had stood, one final sentence shimmered silently on the edge of memory. Justice doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be done and to be seen.